So today I'm going to start reading The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynn Reed Banks. Chapter 1, Birthday Presents. It was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present to him. Far from it. He was really very grateful, sort of. It was without a doubt very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a second-hand plastic Indian that he himself had finished with. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with small plastic figures, of which he had loads. Biscuit tins full, probably 3 or 4 if they were all put away at the same time, which they never were, because most of the time they were scattered about in the bathroom, the loft, the kitchen, the breakfast room, not to mention Omri's bedroom and the garden. The compost heap was full of soldiers which over several autumns had been raked up with the leaves by Omri's mother, who was rather careless about such things. Omri and Patrick had spent many hours together playing with their joint collections of plastic toys. But now they'd had about enough of them, at least for the moment, and that was why when Patrick brought his present to school on Omri's birthday, Omri was disappointed. He tried not to show it, but he was. "Do you really like him?" asked Patrick as Omri stood silently with the Indian in his hand. "Yes, he's fantastic," said Omri in only a slightly flattish voice. "I haven't got an Indian." "I know. I haven't got any cowboys either." "Nor have I. That's why I couldn't play anything with him." Omri opened his mouth to say, "I won't be able to either." But thinking that might hurt Patrick's feelings, he said nothing, put the Indian in his pocket, and forgot about it. After school there was a family tea and all the excitement of his presence from his parents and his 2 older brothers. After school there was a family tea and all the excitement of his presence from his parents and his 2 older brothers. Sorry, sometimes I have to reread a sentence if I don't look at the end, whether it's a period or a paragraph or if there's a comma in there or whatever. Anyway, it's okay to start over. He got his dearest wish, a skateboard complete with kickboard and kryptonic wheels from his mom and dad, and from his eldest brother. I can't remember. A deal? I can't remember. I know there's a movie about this, and I've seen the movie several times, and I can't remember how his name is pronounced. A dial? Oh dear, I might have to rewatch the movie. A helmet. Gillen, his other brother, hadn't bought him anything because he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate accident involving their father's bicycle. So when Gillen's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when a large parcel was put before him, untidily wrapped in brown paper and string. "What is it?" "Have a look. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where the dustbins stood. The 3 boys used to play there sometimes, and occasionally found treasures that other, perhaps richer neighbors had thrown away. So Omri was quite excited as he tore off the paper. Inside was a small white metal cupboard with a mirror in the door, the kind you see over the basin in old-fashioned bathrooms. You might suppose Omri would get another disappointment about this, because the cupboard was fairly plain, and except for a shelf, completely empty. But oddly enough, he was very pleased with it. He loved cupboards of any sort because of the fun of keeping things in them. He was not a very tidy boy in general, but he did like arranging things in cupboards and drawers and then opening them later and finding them just as he'd left them. "I do wish it locked," he said. "You might say thank you before you start complaining," said Gillen. "It's got a keyhole," said their mother, "and I've got a whole box full of keys. Why don't you try all the smaller ones and see if any of them fit?" Most of the keys were much too big, but there were half a dozen that were about the right size. All but one of these were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection, small, with a complicated lock part and a fancy top. A narrow strip of red satin ribbon was looped through one of its curly openings. Omri saved that key to the last. None of the others fitted, and at last he picked up the curly-topped key and carefully put it in the keyhole on the cupboard door, just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn, and regretted wasting his birthday cake cutting wish on something so silly, or rather unlikely, as that he might pass his spelling test next day, which it would take real magic to bring about, as he hadn't even looked at the words since they'd been given out 4 days ago. Now he closed his eyes and unwished the test pass, and wished instead that this little twisty key would turn Gillen's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. "Hey, Mom, I've found one." "Have you, darling? Which one?" His mother came to look. "Oh, that one. How very odd. That was the key to my grandmother's jewel box that she got from Florence. It was made of red leather, and it fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and gave it to me. She was most terribly poor when she died, poor old sweetie, and kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end I said I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world. I threaded it on that bit of ribbon, it was much longer then, and hung it around my neck and told her I'd always wear it and remember her. And I did for a long time. But then the ribbon broke and I nearly lost it." "You could have got a chain for it," said Omri. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have done just that. But I didn't. And now it's your cupboard key. Please don't lose it, Omri, will you?" Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table, and opening it, looked inside thoughtfully. What would he put in it? I thought, what did it say up here? The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. Why did it say the door wouldn't open, but now it's opening? Now I lost my place. What would he put in it? "It's supposed to be for medicine," said Gillen. "You could keep your nose drops in it." "No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I haven't any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in?" his mother suggested, and opened her hand. In it was Patrick's Indian. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." Omri carefully stood the Indian on the shelf. "Are you going to shut the door?" asked his mother. "Yes, and lock it." He did this, and then kissed his mother, and she turned the light out, and he lay down on his side, looking at the cupboard. He felt very content. Just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He had thought he heard a little noise, but no, all was quiet. His eyes closed again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, from which was now coming a most extraordinary series of sounds. A pattering, a tapping, a scrabbling, and surely a high-pitched noise like, well, almost like a tiny voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly there was something alive in that cupboard. At last he put out his hand and touched it. He pulled very carefully. The door was shut tight, but as he pulled, the cupboard moved, just slightly. The noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay still for a long time, wondering. Had he imagined it? The noise did not start again. At last he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered into the dark corners. Suddenly he saw him. But he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard. And he wasn't standing upright. He was crouching in the darkest corner, half hidden by the front of the cupboard. And he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri had kept, lying in bed a moment ago, he was breathing heavily. His bare bronze shoulders rose and fell and were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out of the back of his headband quivered as if the Indian were trembling. And as Omri peered closer and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure, he saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand made a sudden darting movement toward its belt and came to rest clutching the handle of a knife smaller than the shaft of a tack. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from shining white teeth, so small you could scarcely see them, except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the inside wall of the cupboard, clutching his knife, rigid with terror but defiant. The first coherent thought that came into Omri's mind, as he began to get over the shock, was, "I must call the others," meaning his parents and brothers, but something, he wasn't sure what, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment, he would vanish or become plastic again, and then when the others came running, they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up. And who could blame anyone for not believing this unless they saw it with their own eyes? Another reason Omri didn't call anyone was that, if he was not dreaming and the Indian had really come alive, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened to Omri in his life, and he wanted to keep it to himself, at least at first. His next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. The Indian gave a fantastic leap into the air. His black hair flew and the fringes on his leggings fluttered. His knife, raised above his head, flashed. He gave a shout, which, even though it was a tiny shout to match his body, was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump. But not so much as he jumped when the little knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger in his mouth and sucked it, and thought how gigantic he must look to the tiny Indian, and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there, his feet, in moccasins, planted apart on the white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quite wild. Omri thought he was magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth, and a stream of words, spoken in that loud, tiny voice, came out, not one of which Omri could understand. "Don't you speak English?" asked Omri. All the Indians in films spoke a sort of English. It would be terrible if his Indian couldn't. How would they talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife a fraction. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life, but it must be something to do with this cupboard, or perhaps the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great. I don't mind that you stabbed me, only please can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian," he finished in a very reasonable tone. He said all this very quickly while the Indian stared at him. The knife point went down a little farther, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I?" "Say something," urged Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the miniature Indian at last. "Oh," Omri thought, and then said very slowly, "Let me pick you up." The knife came up again in an instant, and the Indian's knees bent into a crouch. "No! Oh, please! You touch, I kill," the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from a tiny creature, scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint. But Omri didn't laugh. He didn't even feel like laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian, brave, and despite the vast difference in their sizes and strengths, Omri respected him and even, odd as it sounds, feared him at the moment. "Oh, okay, I won't then. But there's no need to get angry. I don't want to hurt you." Then, as the Indian looked baffled, he said, in what he supposed was Indian English, "Me no hurt you." "You come near, I hurt you," said the Indian swiftly. Omri had been half lying in bed all this time. Now, cautiously and slowly, he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be sure why he was being cautious. Was it so as not to frighten the Indian? Or because he was frightened himself? He wished one of his brothers would come in, or better still, his father. But no one came. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard by its top corners and turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted, and having nothing to hold on to, he fell down. But he was on his feet again in a second, and he had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," said Omri. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes. Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight. He was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair, done in a plait and pressed to his head by a colored headband, gleamed in the sun. So did the minuscule muscles of his tiny naked torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings which had some decoration on them too small to see properly. He wore a kind of bandolier across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow, were his moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where his magnifying glass was. It was the only way he would ever be able to see and appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked as closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The turkey feather that had been stuck in the headband had come out when the Indian fell and was now lying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. Omri suddenly asked, "Were you always this small?" "I not small. You big," the Indian shouted angrily. "No," began Omri, but then he stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about next door. The Indian heard it too. He froze. The door of the next room opened. Omri knew that at any moment his mother would come in to wake him for school. In a flash he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into his bed. "Come on, Omri, time to get up." She bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open. Well, that's the end of chapter 1. Let's see. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 2. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to get a good start. Chapter 2. The door is shut. Omri got dressed in a state of such high excitement that he could scarcely control his fumbling fingers enough to do up buttons and tie his shoelaces. He'd thought he was excited yesterday on his birthday, but it was nothing compared to how he felt now. He was dying to open the cupboard door and have another look, but the landing outside his bedroom door was like a railway station at this hour of the morning, parents and brothers passing continually, and and if he were to close his door for a moment's privacy, somebody would be sure to burst in. He'd nip up after breakfast and have a quick look when he was supposed to be cleaning his teeth. However, it didn't work out. There was a stupid row at the breakfast table because a dial took the last of the Rice Krispies, and although there were plenty of cornflakes, not to mention sugar puffs, the other two fairly set upon a dial and made such an awful fuss that their mother lost her temper, and the end of it was nobody got to clean their teeth at all. They were all bundled out of the house at the last minute. Omri even forgot to take his swimming things, although it was Thursday, the day his class went to the pool. He was an excellent swimmer, and he was so annoyed when he remembered, halfway to school, too late to go back, that he turned on the dial and shouted, "You made me forget my swimming stuff," and bashed him. That naturally led to them all being late for school and furthermore arriving in a very grubby condition. All this actually pushed the Indian right out of Omri's mind, but the minute he set eyes on Patrick he remembered, and not for one single second for the rest of the day was that Indian out of Omri's thoughts. You may imagine the temptation to tell Patrick what had happened. Several times Omri very nearly did tell him, and he couldn't help dropping a number of tantalizing hints. "Your present was the best thing I got." Patrick looked rather astonished. "I thought you got a skateboard." "Yes, but I like yours better." "Better than a skateboard? Are you kidding me? Yours turned out to be more exciting." Patrick just stared at him. "Are you being sarcastic?" "No." Later, after they'd had the spelling test and Omri had been marked 3 right out of 10, Patrick joked, "I bet the plastic Indian could have done better." Unwarily, Omri replied, "Oh, I don't think he can write English. He can only just speak." He stopped himself quickly, but Patrick was giving him a very odd look. "What?" "Nothing." "No, what did you say about him speaking?" Omri wrestled with himself. He wanted to keep his secret. In any case, Patrick wouldn't believe him. Yet the need to talk about it was very strong. "He can speak," he said slowly at last. "Beard," said Patrick, which was their school slang for "I don't believe you." Instead of insisting, Omri said nothing more, and that led Patrick to ask, "Why did you say that about him speaking?" "He does." "Itchy beard," which of course means the same, only more so. Omri refused to get involved in an argument. He was somehow scared that if he talked about the Indian, something bad would happen. In fact, as the day went on and he longed more and more to get home, he began to feel certain that the whole incredible happening, well, not that it hadn't happened, but that something would go wrong. All his thoughts, all his dreams were centered on the miraculous, endless possibilities opened up by a real, live, miniature Indian of his very own. It would be too terrible if the whole thing turned out to be some sort of mistake. After school, Patrick wanted him to stay on the school grounds and skateboard. For weeks, Omri had longed to do this, but had never had his own skateboard till now. So it was quite beyond Patrick's understanding when Omri said, "I can't. I have to get home. Anyway, I didn't bring it." "Why not? Are you crazy? Why do you have to get home anyway?" "I want to play with the Indian." Patrick's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Can I come?" Omri hesitated. But no, it wouldn't do. He must get to know the Indian himself before he even thought of introducing him to anyone else, even Patrick. Besides, the most awful thought had come to Omri during the last lesson, which had made it almost impossible for him to sit still. If the Indian were real and not just, well, moving plastic as Pinocchio had been moving wood, then he would need food and other things. And Omri had left him shut up in the dark all day with nothing. Perhaps, what if there were not enough air for him in that cupboard? The door fitted very tight. How much air would such a very small creature need? What if the Indian were... what if he died? shut up there. What if Omri had killed him? At the very best, the Indian must have passed a horrible day in that dark prison. Omri was appalled at the thought of it. Why had he allowed himself to be drawn into that silly row at breakfast, instead of slipping away and making sure the Indian was all right? The mere thought that he might be dead was frightening Omri sick. He ran all the way home, burst through the back door, and raced up the stairs without even saying hello to his mother. He shut the door of his bedroom and fell on his knees beside the bedside table. With a hand that shook, he turned the key in the lock and opened the cupboard door. The Indian lay there on the floor of the cupboard, stiff and stark. Too stiff. That was not a dead body. Omri picked it up. It was an it, not a he anymore. The Indian was made of plastic again. Omri knelt there, appalled, too appalled to move. He had killed his Indian, or done something awful to him. At the same time he had killed his dream, all the wonderful, exciting, secret games that had filled his imagination all day. But that was not the main horror. His Indian had been real, not a mere toy, but a person. And now here he lay in Omri's hand, cold, stiff, lifeless. Somehow, through Omri's own fault. How had it happened? It never occurred to Omri now that he had imagined the whole incredible episode this morning. The Indian was in a completely different position from the one he had been in when Patrick gave him to Omri. Then he had been standing on one leg as if doing a war dance, knees bent, one moccasined foot raised, both elbows bent, with one fist with the knife in it in the air. Now he lay flat, legs apart, arms at his sides. His eyes were closed. The knife was no longer a part of him. It lay separately on the floor of the cupboard. Omri picked it up. The easiest way to do this, he found, was to wet his finger and press it down on the tiny knife, which stuck to it. It, too, was plastic and could no more have pierced human skin than a twist of paper. Yet it had pierced Omri's finger this morning. The little mark was still there. But this morning it had been a real knife. Omri stroked the Indian with his finger. There was a painful thickness in the back of his throat, the pain of sadness, disappointment, and a strange sort of guilt burned inside him, as if he had swallowed a very hot potato that wouldn't cool down. He let the tears come and just knelt there and cried for about 10 minutes. Then he put the Indian back in the cupboard and locked the door because he couldn't bear to look at him any longer. That night at supper he couldn't eat anything, and he couldn't talk. His father touched Omri's face and said it felt very hot. His mother took him upstairs and put him to bed, and oddly enough he didn't object. He didn't know if he was ill or not, but he felt so bad he was quite glad to be made a fuss of. Not that that improved the basic situation, but it was some comfort. "What is it, Omri? Tell me," coaxed his mother. She stroked his hair and looked at him tenderly and questioningly, and he nearly told her everything, but then he suddenly rolled over on his face. "Nothing, really." She sighed, kissed him, or rather the back of him, and left the room, closing the door softly after her. As soon as she had gone, he heard something. A scratching, a muttering, a definitely alive sound coming from the cupboard. Omri snapped his bedside light on and stared wide-eyed at his own face in the mirror on the cupboard door. He stared at the key with its twisted ribbon. He listened to the sounds, now unmistakable. He tremblingly turned the key, and there was the Indian, on the shelf this time, almost exactly level with Omri's face. Alive again! Again they stared at each other. Then Omri asked falteringly, "What happened to you?" "Happen? Good sleep happen. Cold ground, need blanket, food, fire." Omri gaped. Was the little man giving him orders? Undoubtedly he was, because he waved his knife, now back in his hand, in an unmistakable way. Omri was so happy he could scarcely speak. "Okay, you stay here. I'll get food. Don't worry," he gasped as he scrambled out of bed. He hurried downstairs, excited but thoughtful. What could it all mean? That the moment the cupboard door closed, the Indian went to sleep? It was puzzling, but he didn't bother worrying about it too much. His main concern was to get downstairs without his parents hearing him, get to the kitchen, find some food that would suit the Indian, and bring it back without anyone asking questions. Fortunately, his parents were in the living room watching television, so he was able to tiptoe to the kitchen along the dark passage. Once there, he dared not turn on the light, but there was the refrigerator light, and that was enough. He surveyed the inside of the refrigerator. What did Indians eat? Meat, chiefly, he supposed, deer meat, rabbits, the sort of animals they could shoot on their land. Needless to say, there was nothing of that sort. Biscuits, jam, peanut butter, that sort of thing was no problem, but somehow Omri felt sure these were not Indian foods. Suddenly his searching eyes fell on an open tin of sweet corn. He found a paper plate in the drawer where the picnic stuff lived and took a good teaspoonful of corn. Then he broke off a crusty corner of bread. Then he thought of some cheese. And what about a drink? Milk? Surely Indian braves did not drink milk. They usually drank something called fire water in films, which was presumably a hot drink, and Omri dared not heat anything. Ordinary non-fire water would have to do, unless... What about some Coke? That was an American drink. Lucky there was a bit in a big bottle left over from his birthday, so he took that. He did wish there was some cold meat, but there just wasn't. Clutching the Coke bottle by the neck in one hand and the paper plate in the other, Omri sneaked back upstairs with fast-beating heart. All was just as he had left it, except that the Indian was sitting on the edge of the shelf, dangling his legs and trying to sharpen his knife on the metal. He jumped up as soon as he saw Omri. "Food?" he asked eagerly. "Yes, but I don't know if it's what you like." "I like. Give quick." But Omri wanted to arrange things a little. He took a pair of scissors and cut a small circle out of the paper plate. On this he put a crumb of bread, another of cheese, and one kernel of the sweet corn. He handed this offering to the Indian, who backed off, looking at the food with hungry eyes, but trying to keep watch on Omri at the same time. "Not touch. You touch. I use knife," he warned. "All right, I promise not to. Now you can eat." Very cautiously the Indian sat down, this time cross-legged on the shelf. At first he tried to eat with his left hand, keeping the knife at the ready in his sight, but he was so hungry he soon abandoned this effort, laid the knife close at his side, and grabbing the bread in one hand and the little crumb of cheese in the other, he began to tear at them ravenously. When these two apparently familiar foods had taken the edge off his appetite, he turned his attention to the single kernel of corn. "What?" he asked suspiciously. "Corn, like you have." Omri hesitated. "Where you come from," he said. It was a shot in the dark. He didn't know if the Indian came from anywhere, but he meant to find out. The Indian grunted, turning the corn about in both hands, for it was half as big as his head. He smelled it. A great grin spread over his face. He nibbled it. The grin grew wider, but then he held it away and looked again, and the grin vanished. "Too big," he said. "Like you," he added accusingly. "Eat it. It's the same stuff." The Indian took a bite. He still looked very suspicious, but he ate and ate. He couldn't finish it, but he evidently liked it. "Give meat," he said finally. "I'm sorry, I can't find any tonight, but I'll get you some tomorrow," said Omri. After another grunt, the Indian said, "Drink." Omri had been waiting for this. From the box where he kept his Action Man things, he had brought a plastic mug. It was much too big for the Indian, but it was the best he could do. Into it, with extreme care, he now poured a minute amount of Coke from the huge bottle. He handed it to the Indian, who had to hold it with both hands and still almost dropped it. "What?" he barked after smelling it. "Coca-Cola," said Omri, enthusiastically pouring some for himself into a cup. "Fire water?" "No, it's cold, but you'll like it." The Indian sipped, swallowed, gulped, gulped again, grinned. "Good?" asked Omri. "Good," said the Indian. Cheers, said Omri, raising his cup as he'd seen his parents do when they were having a drink together. What cheers? I don't know, said Omri, feeling excessively happy, and drank, his Indian eating and drinking. He was real, a real flesh and blood person. It was too marvelous. Omri felt he might die of delight. Do you feel better now? He asked. I better. You not better, said the Indian. You still big. You stop eat. Get the right size. Omri laughed aloud, then stopped himself hastily. It's time to sleep, he said. Not now. Big light. Sleep when light go. I can't make the light go, said Omri, and switched out his bedside lamp. In the darkness came a thin cry of astonishment and fear. Omri switched the light on again. The Indian was now gazing at him with something more than respect, a sort of awe. You great white spirit? He asked in a whisper. No, said Omri, and this isn't the sun, it's a lamp. Don't you have lamps? The Indian peered where he was pointing. That lamp? He asked unbelievingly. Much big lamp, need much oil. But this isn't an oil lamp. It works by electricity. Magic? No, electricity. But speaking of magic, how did you get here? The Indian looked at him steadily out of his black eyes. You not know? No, I don't. You were a toy. Then I put you in the cupboard and locked the door. When I opened it, you were real. Then I locked it again, and you went back to being plastic. Then, he stopped sharply. Wait. What if, he thought furiously, it was possible? In which case... Listen, he said excitedly. I want you to come out of there. I'll find you a much more comfortable place. You said you were cold. I'll make you a proper teepee. Teepee? The Indian shouted. I no live teepee. I live longhouse. Omri was so eager to test his theory about the cupboard that he was impatient. You'll have to make do with a teepee tonight, he said. Hastily he opened a drawer and took out a biscuit tin full of little plastic people. Somewhere in here was a plastic teepee. Ah, here! He pounced on it, a small, pinkish, cone-shaped object with designs rather badly painted on its plastic sides. Will this do? He put it on the shelf beside the Indian, who looked at it with the utmost scorn. This teepee? He said. He touched its plastic side and made a face. He pushed it with both hands. It slid along the shelf. He bent and peered in through the triangular opening. Then he actually spat on the ground, or rather on the shelf. Oh, said Omri, rather crestfallen. You mean it's not good enough? Not want toy, said the Indian, and turned his back, folding both arms across his chest with an air of finality. Omri saw his chance. With one quick movement he had picked up the Indian by the waist between his thumb and forefinger. In doing this he pinned the knife, which was in the Indian's belt, firmly to his side. The dangling Indian twisted, wreathed, kicked, made a number of ferocious and hideous faces, but beyond that he was helpless, and he evidently knew it, for after a few moments he decided it was more dignified to stop struggling. Instead, he folded his tiny arms across his chest once again, put his head back, and stared with proud defiance at Omri's face, which was now level with his own. For Omri, the feeling of holding this little creature in his fingers was very strange and wonderful. If he had had any doubts that the Indian was truly alive, the sensation he had now would have put them to rest. His body was heavier now, warm and firm and full of life. Through Omri's thumb, on the Indian's left side, he could feel his heart beating wildly, like a bird's. Although the Indian felt strong, Omri could sense how fragile he was, how easily an extra squeeze could injure him. He would have liked to feel him all over, his tiny arms and legs, his hair, his ears, almost too small to see. Yet when he saw how the Indian, who was altogether in his power, faced him boldly and hid his fear, he lost all desire to handle him. He felt it was cruel and insulting to the Indian, who was no longer his plaything, but a person who had to be respected. Omri put him down gently on the chest of drawers where the cupboard stood. Then he crouched down till his face was again level with the Indian's. "Sorry I did that," he said. The Indian, breathing heavily and with his arms still folded, said nothing, but stared haughtily at him as if nothing he did could affect him in any way. "What's your name?" asked Omri. "Little Bear," said the Indian, pointing proudly to himself. "Iroquois brave, son of chief." "You son of chief?" he shot at Omri fiercely. "No," said Omri humbly. Snorted Little Bear with a superior look. "Name?" Omri told him. "Now we must find you another place to sleep, outside the cupboard. Surely you sleep in teepees sometimes." "Never," said Little Bear firmly. "I've never heard of an Indian who didn't," said Omri, with equal firmness. "You'll have to tonight, anyway." "Not toy," said the Indian. "This no good. And fire. I want fire." "I can't light a real fire in here, but I'll make you a teepee. It won't be very good, but I promise you a better one tomorrow." He looked around. It was good, he thought, that he never put anything away. Now everything he needed was strewn about the floor and on tables and shelves ready to hand. Starting with some pickup sticks and a bit of string, he made a sort of cone shape, tied at the top. Around this he draped first a handkerchief, and then, when that didn't seem firm enough, a bit of odd felt from a hat that had been in the dressing-up crate. It was fawn-colored, fortunately, and looked rather like animal hide. In fact, when it was pinned together at the back with a couple of safety pins and a slit cut for an entrance, the whole thing looked pretty good, especially with the poles sticking up through a hole in the top. Omri stood it up carefully on the chest of drawers and anxiously awaited Little Bear's verdict. The Indian walked around it 3 times slowly, went down on hands and knees, and crawled in through the flap, came out again after a minute, tugged at the felt, stood back to look at the poles, and finally gave a fairly satisfied grunt. However, he wasn't going to pass it without any criticism at all. "No pictures," he growled. "If teepee, then need pictures." "I don't know how to do them," said Omri. "I know. You give colors. I make." "Tomorrow," said Omri, who despite himself was beginning to feel very sleepy. "Blanket?" Omri fished out one of the Action Man's sleeping rolls. "No good. No keep out wind." Omri started to object that there was no wind in his bedroom, but then he decided it was easier to cut up a square out of one of his old sweaters. So he did that. It was a red one with a stripe around the bottom, and even Little Bear couldn't hide his approval as he held it up, then wrapped it around himself. "Good. Warm. I sleep now." He dropped on his knees and crawled into the tent. After a moment he stuck his head out. "Tomorrow talk. You give Little Bear meat, fire, color, much things." He scowled fiercely up at Omri. "Good?" "Good," said Omri, and indeed nothing in his life had ever promised better. Until next time.